This is the true story of a private pilot who ended up being in way over his head. It is one of many like it, but I'd like to review it with you, as there were many lessons learnt that day. He agreed to let me share his story with you, but he asked to remain anonymous. Several years ago, a private pilot and his non-pilot friend embarked on a journey across Europe in a Robin DR400. They planned to visit several places. It's October, however, and their plans have had to change on multiple occasions, including an unscheduled stop at an airfield in Austria a few days prior. The pilot holds a private pilot license, has no instrument rating, and around 150 hours of flight time. He has completed his theory exams to partake in commercial training, but he still needs to fly another 20 hours or so before he meets the minimum hour requirement. On this day, the pair were at a small airfield in Hungary, and were planning on flying to a small airport outside of Prague. Austria is an IMC, and so the private pilot plans to avoid the worst of the weather by going north over Slovakia before flying west to Czechia. METARs along the route indicate ceilings as low as 1,000 feet and not less than 5 kilometers of visibility. Showers of rain are reported throughout the entirety of Europe. The forecasts don't indicate any worsening of the conditions for the rest of the day. After days of delay, the private pilot sees this weather as the window needed to continue on the journey. He's apprehensive, but going by the numbers, it is legal to go. He and his friend leave their hotel, put their bags in the aircraft, and start the engine. The pilot becomes more confident as he gets in the air. Conditions look better than what he had feared over at the departure airport. As they cross the border into Slovakia, however, the aircraft encounters its first rain showers. The sky begins to darken, and the cloud ceilings begin to drop, forcing the aircraft to fly lower in worsening visibility. Worried that the conditions and forecast have worsened since he checked the weather last, he contacts the Slovakian FIS controller, requesting the current METAR for a number of nearby airports. To the pilot's surprise, however, the controller refuses to provide him with the requested information. Based on the interaction he had with the controller since entering the airspace and this exchange, the pilot feels like the controller is unwilling to help him. As far as he can tell, he's on his own. He makes the decision to turn around and go back to where he knows the conditions are safe, the departure airport. Upon turning around, however, he realizes that the weather has closed in around him. He is trapped in, and the only way forwards now is into the clouds. What happens next is only possible by a series of incredibly fortunate factors. Firstly, the pilot had already taken several instrument flying lessons at his local flying club, wanting to become familiar with instrument flying. He had at least just enough skill to fly the aircraft on his instruments. Secondly, and perhaps most fortunately, was the diversion that he and his friend had made into Austria a few days prior. On that day, to kill some time, they had visited a pilot equipment shop at that airfield and purchased a GPS receiver for his tablet, which he was using at this point as an electronic chart. Prior to the stop in Austria, the pilot's application for the charts had no means to determine where on the chart he was. Now, however, using the GPS receiver, the pilot was able to pinpoint his exact location using the app as a GPS. Knowing what was about to happen, the pilot sets his electronic charts to route him directly to the departure airport and gives it to his passenger, whom he briefs to tell him to turn left or right to keep the aircraft icon on the magenta line. He then focuses on his instruments and climbs to the MSA. The attitude indicator becomes his world. He focuses on maintaining attitude. After what seems like an eternity, there's a break in the weather. They're back in the clear. Relieved, the pilot lands back at the departure airport, and the pair go to the hotel to come up with a new plan. VFR into IMC remains the deadliest thing a pilot can do, with half of related accidents resulting in fatality. Furthermore, even instrument-rated pilots are not immune to the risk. Although instrument-rated pilots are 13 times more likely to survive such an event, 30% of the fatal accidents involved an instrument-rated pilot at the controls. I personally knew a fully rated flight instructor who died with his students in one such accident. There were multiple times where the pilot had a chance to avoid getting in the situation. There was hesitation. He was uneasy with the weather. It was legal, but he knew that legal didn't necessarily mean safe. As a private pilot with very little experience, any hesitance should have been enough to make him cancel the flight. So why didn't he? The reality of the situation is the pilot didn't have any commercial pressures, but he did have social ones. He was flying with a friend who needed to get back to the place where they started the journey. His friend had taken holidays from work to come over. He needed to be back by a certain date to get back to work. The pilot was aware of this and wanted to get his friend back home on time. After this experience, the pilot realized what he had done. He had put his friend's life at risk, which was completely unacceptable. He told his friend to book a flight from the local international airport to go back home so that he could stay with the aircraft and remove that social pressure. It seems quite clear that on the day, the controller wasn't particularly helpful, and I might argue was unwilling to provide the service that they were hired to do. The private pilot, with his inexperience, didn't know how to react and was probably intimidated by the interaction. Instead of avoiding further conversation with the controller, the pilot should have declared an emergency and demanded that the controller give him the level of service he needed. It's easy to say in hindsight, but that decision can be quite difficult to make in the air. Setting personal minimums is something I hear a lot of pilots in the US talk about, and there's real value to that. The issue is, talking about personal minimums is not the same as actually setting them, and there's limited guidance on how to do that. Had the pilot incorporated a structured set of rules to abide by ahead of time, the decision would have been taken out of his hands. This is exactly how airline pilots operate. They have a set of operation manuals that tell them when they can go or cannot go, and what they can or cannot do. Airlines have many operation manuals, but as general aviation pilots, we can focus on just two for now, OMA and OMB. OMA focuses on the sorts of rules that would have prevented these events from transpiring in the first place. OMA outlines rules when a flight can take place. It will take into account experience, recency, proficiency, aircraft equipment, weather, and so forth. Should the flight break the rules in the OMA, and I mean any of the rules, then the flight should not take place, even if it is legal and possibly safe. By living by the OM you create ahead of time, a large portion of the decision-making burden is removed from you, the pilot. The OMB is similar, but focuses instead on the practical aspects of flight and pre-flight preparation. In the airlines, the OMB specifically tells you how to operate the aircraft, which checklists to use, and what the standard operating procedures are. Had the pilot had a manual to refer to, instead of just analyzing the weather with no formal guidance other than the legal limits, he never would have departed, and he would never have put his and his friend's life in danger. I know the pilot in the story quite well. I know that he was always very determined to be safe. He had read all the books, he was flying regularly with instructors, and doing thorough pre-flight briefings and planning ahead of every single flight. We had, together, discussed get-there-itis prior to this incident as a general topic, and at the time we both thought that we would never fall for it. In the end, it turns out no one is entirely immune to it. The pilot told me that after all these years, he still couldn't believe how unbelievably lucky he was that day. The number of lucky breaks that lined up on that day still baffles him. Had he not had to divert into Austria, he wouldn't have had the GPS unit, and would have had little to no way to navigate back to the airport he departed from. Had he not practiced basic instrument flying, mere weeks before, which he almost didn't do, he might have succumbed to spatial disorientation. In his words, I felt like I was in a steep turn the whole time. It was really difficult to not correct this bank angle that didn't exist. Had I not trusted the AI like my instructor told me, I don't think I would be here today. Finally, had he been alone, being a low-hour private pilot without an instrument rating, he probably would have struggled with the workload of both flying the aircraft in the clouds and using a GPS to navigate. Writing manuals for yourself can be a daunting task. Well, I've decided to help you with that. The OMA and OMB in the airlines can be hundreds of pages long. They certainly were for the airline I worked for. However, that would be too much and far too complex to be sustainable for private pilots. Instead, what I have done is written 2 manuals, 10 or fewer pages long. Combined, they will help you make decisions when things aren't as clear as you would want them to be. At the end of the day though, they are nothing more than tools to help you make a decision. You remain pilot in command. That never changes. If you're interested in downloading the manuals and making them your own by modifying them as you please, make sure to use the link in the description below. Remember that neither of them are legally binding and that it is the responsibility of the pilot to make the correct and safe decisions. I hope that even if you don't use manuals in your personal flying, you at least have a system in place. To find out more about the psychology of poor decision making in general aviation pilots in a fun and interesting way, I strongly recommend Rod Machado's seminar, Samurai Airmanship, and I do really recommend it. It is one of 14 lectures I have been listening to for years now, over 10 years. I absolutely love them. As a student and private pilot, I would listen to them on loop, taking everything Rod taught in these seminars to heart. It is his teachings that actually made me become passionate about aviation safety and instruction and led me to start this channel. I often share affiliate links to his products, but this one is by far my favorite. I cannot say enough how much I recommend these recordings and how much they've changed my life. It's also pretty cheap at about $24.95 for all 14 lectures. Although these lessons are old by now, they still remain incredibly valuable and really relevant. Link is in the description below. Have you ever had a scary moment in an aircraft? I know I have. How about we continue this discussion in the comments below? I'm Tarek Merryface. I'll see you guys next time, and happy flying.